Hey, welcome and thanks for joining us at the New Ways series. Today we're talking about the new ways for creating change. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this recording on the lands of the Darug people, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all meet today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this meeting. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. As I said, today's focus is on change. Now, it means different things to different people. So we've assembled a top shelf panel of experts in different types of change. Marie Lambrechts from the world of corporate change management, Martin Stewart Weeks from a public agency perspective, and Tarania Sahud from a social change perspective. So welcome everyone. And if you are tuning in on the web, be sure to send through any questions as they arise, and we'll get to them in the second half of the panel. But let's start with you, Marie. You have enormous experience of really massive change programs for global organizations, and you've seen the best and maybe the worst of change management. Tell us what you think is needed for a change program to get started, and how do you know when a business is ready for change?
Yes, interesting question. So I think we've all maybe Googled why do projects fail? And I think we can all answer that question and say, well, it starts with vision and leadership. But what does that really mean? What does it look like when leadership is really leading the way? And an example of that is recently we got our top executives to really speak from the heart and explain to the business exactly what service transformation meant for them. And we asked them key questions such as what will it take from the business to make this change successful? We asked them to come up with a call to action. So what's the so what factor? How are we going to make this change real and make it happen? And the other factor to that is it's easy to do a glossy PowerPoint and say, well, this is what the change is about. But what can we do to make it visual, almost make it possible for the business to touch it and feel it? So we included a technology deep dive to show to people how will this technology play out in their business process in the future. And we've had great success with that, with people actually now starting to ask questions, engage, and really know what service transformation is all about. So that's number one, is just really having that spark. But I think the second aspect to that is getting started is almost easy. And as soon as business pressures kick in, we run out of steam very easily. So you'll have to think of yourself almost as a marketer, and the marketers will tell you all about, what does it take to lead to an actual sale? And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to sell behavior. We're trying to sell adoption. So what does your engagement journey look like? How are we going to keep our customers, our internal stakeholders, warm? So an example of that is we designed a series of toolbox talks to start cool and then warm up closer towards go live, and saying, well, we've got a month where we really need to warm up so that people can engage, and by the time we get to the go live, people will be enthused to adopt the change. Your second question was more about how do we know if business is ready? So the first step to that is having a change management framework, and then designing your readiness checks against the framework, and then also looking at when are you going to be checking for what. Let's say you have a 6 month engagement journey leading up to when you actually want to transition into a new way of working. You'd be dropping in readiness checks every 2 months, and initially you might only look at things such as vision and leadership. And do we know who our stakeholders are? Have we done a stakeholder analysis? Next time we check in, we might be looking at change impact analysis and change actions. So yes, we've understood what those impacts are, but what have we actually done about it? And how have we notified the business, and what was their reaction? And that's how you really build up your change readiness framework. And every single readiness check should result in a number of readiness actions. And your final check would be reviewing all of the readiness actions to see if the business is really ready to adopt the change. You'd be looking at things like transitioning to business as usual as well. So how do we make sure that we have a reinforcement plan in place? I think we all know that change happens after change happens. Yes, we've gone live, but so what? And how do we make sure our business leaders are still with us and really driving that change to adoption?
So there's a combination of strategy and tactics all happening at the same time. It sounds like there's so many balls in the air.
I think that's the only way with change, isn't it? It's a very exciting space to be in. There's never a dull moment.
Tarania, your background's in complex thinking, and now that COVID-19 has produced this massive uncertainty in all sorts of areas, from economics through to workplace to home, but it's also changed lots of practices and the ways that we think about the world, the way that we work. What are the complex changes in terms of their impact, and how is that playing out in what you're seeing, and what things are sustainable, what things are going to be lasting, do you think?
Well, look, first of all, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm sitting. And I want to acknowledge that the land was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and into the future. And I also just thinking about recently, I've been kind of working quite closely with a wonderful Aboriginal man named David Beaumont from the City of Sydney, and he's kind of given, I think, the group that I'm also working with the courage to actually think about this time for us to be the greatest expression of ourselves. So I'm kind of coming with that. Thank you also for introducing me as a social change agent, because I think that's predominantly the way I see myself. So, oh gosh, what are the issues? Yeah, we are in such a difficult time, such a challenging time, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to discuss these issues, and also to be with Marie and Martin and yourself, from such diverse backgrounds. And we're in this time where people are actually really quite concerned about the precariousness of work. We've got increasing homelessness, we've got climate change, we've got biodiversity loss. There are just so many issues. And with COVID-19, the whole food insecurity, it became a bigger issue. Homelessness is rising. And at the same time, we've had increasing numbers of increasing wealth for billionaires. So we're having to look at, how are our systems allowing this to happen, that there's greater poverty at one end and then greater wealth at the other, and how do we change our systems, and what systems are sustainable, but in fact, how do we actually work with change at this time? And when I think about change, I have to think about context. So if I think about a particular organisation or a particular issue, I have to go, what's the context and what are the opportunities, what are the strengths we can work with, and what are the relationships. But the key things that I'm probably going to be emphasising today, which sort of recognise my own strengths, are thinking about context and interrelatedness. That's kind of all part of complexity thinking and systems thinking. Coming from a social change perspective, where's the agency in community? What can community do? What changes? How can communities and organisations work together to not just have sustainable change, but have a sense that we have agency and we can make a difference together? And how can we build our relationships so that we can achieve more together? To me, that's the sustainability bit, is actually the sustainability or the actual creating change that we want to see. Relationships are absolutely key, and recognising context. And I guess I want to say, sort of personally, for myself, because these have been times where people have been more isolated, greater mental health issues are coming up. People are, we came out of the bushfires, then went into COVID-19, and then of course the whole general climate change. So I just want to say what's been sustaining me in these times. What has been sustaining me has been the looking outwards. Certainly kind of, having a good relationship with myself, but the looking outwards and not just thinking about my own business, but thinking about the collective as in, the world, the local community. And for me, it's been about how can I make a difference for the greater good? Because if I make a greater difference to the greater good, and I join up with other people who are doing that, and there are so many, I'm just going to feel so much better. And that's actually I've actually been quite okay in COVID because of that, because I've been joining up with other people who are working for the greater good.
it's a bit like, as a little bit like Marie was saying about the idea of shared visions and shared values, and how we all need to look for those, but we need to articulate them as well. So seeing them coming out of community is fantastic, but then also seeing that sense of community engagement and alignment across different stakeholder groups or communities or individuals is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Martin, you've worked extensively with government, and you're a co-author of a book on digital transformation of government and the public sector in Australia. And it's titled, Are We There Yet? Which we all often feel like we're saying all the time. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? What's your take on how governments approach change, and how is it different? Do governments lead the change that happens across business, or do they follow commercial practice? What's that big difference there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a couple of observations I want to make. The first is that for the last 30 or 40 years in the public sector and government around the world, but certainly in Australia, New Zealand, UK, a lot of other places, and many people who are watching this show, this conversation will know, we've been in the grip of something which has been labelled the new public management. And very much and very self-consciously back in the sort of 80s, it was thereabouts. And unfortunately, as you can tell by the colour of my hair, I was there. Obviously incredibly young, but I was there. And the new public management was a very deliberate effort by governments around the world and public sectors to, if I can put it like this, to lead by copying, to take a number of tools, techniques, attitudes, culture, processes from private and corporate management and import them and adapt them. Some might say not as much as they should have been adapting, but essentially to say in many, many respects, the work of government is no different from the work of any other sector. Why don't we learn from what was then considered very much to be the place you went to go to when you wanted to work out how to do change effectively, be efficient, be productive and innovative and all the rest of it. What's interesting in the last few years, and it's been captured in a number of places, including the recent review of the Australian Public Service by David Thodey and others, is that there is a genuine sense, in my view, that movement, if we can call it that frame of reference that says, let's essentially look to the private sector and business and find the tools and techniques and we'll import them, has sort of come to an end. And I think there is a sense that increasingly what we've got to do in government and the public sector is not exactly think for ourselves. I think we've always done that, but to recognise that straight kind of following by copying and bringing these kinds of tools in is limited in its application and its value. That's the first observation. I think we're right in the middle right now, and I'm sure, as I say, there'll be people who will be on this call who I think will be even closer to the sharp end of this. We're right in the middle of a huge transition, in my view. Question is, what is it that comes next if it's not taking all those tools like strategic planning and strategic management, performance reviews and performance management and performance pay? What are the distinctively public sector ways of changing? So that's one quick observation. The second one I'd quickly throw on the table is an observation I'd make actually in relation to some research I was doing recently, which caused me to have a look back at some of the momentous work that Lyndon Johnson did in the 60s in cahoots with the civil rights movement in America. And it suddenly struck me as I was watching him, one of his amazing speeches when he was, fun enough and very pertinently to what's been going on over the last few days in the US, was actually getting the Voting Rights Act as part of the civil rights bill's legislative package through the Congress. It occurred to me then that the great strengths of public leadership are sometimes to follow and sometimes to lead. There are times when what great public leaders do is strike out in a direction that they feel deeply needs to be taken, and they will make their case, and you can think of the great leaders perhaps that you might quickly spring to mind, Winston Churchill and FDR and Nelson Mandela, whatever. They'll be ahead of the game and they will be arguing passionately for people to follow them. But there are other times, and it strikes me that what Johnson was so clever in doing and so impressive in some respects was to use his extraordinary legislative and political skills, not necessarily to lead on his own, although it was an act of leadership to do what he did, but actually to engage what was by then a massive movement, social movement, exactly as Tarani has just been talking about, where a real sense of agency had started the ball rolling that he had to, in a sense, engage with and help and relate to. So was he leading? Was he following? My sense is a little bit of both. And I think in the public space, getting that sweet spot is often a real sign of effective leaders.
It's a great segue back into my next question, which is going to go to Tarania again, which is exactly on that, that sort of conversation around, you know, when we look to communities, you know, exactly as Martin was saying there, we often look at grassroots and we see practices that emerge out of the grassroots and out of communities, but that's also an act of leadership. And how can we embrace those positive movements in the way that Martin's talking about, and how do we bring those to fruition or to wider audiences?
Okay, well, by inviting me to speak like you have today, which is awesome. Well, look, in that case, maybe I'll just share. I was going to sort of speak to that a bit later, but currently I'm kind of working with convening a group called Sydney Commons Lab. And we've also been working with City of Sydney, and I think this is a great example. As in, well, first of all, can I just say what the Commons is? And
yeah, go for it.
Right. So the Commons. Look, I start with as a paradigm. I think about it as a paradigm that it has an operating system for looking at how do we live and work as if we care about each other. And at the moment, our systems have progressed so much that we're out of balance in being able to do that. And part of the reason is because the private sector is kind of sort of is very strong, and the public sector can be bureaucratic and not allow community to actually lead. And so we need to rebalance this. And we need community to lead. And the Commons is very much about, we can't just lead through lovely community spirit. The community actually needs to own more, and the community needs to actually come together and share resources. It's both about sharing resources and stewarding resources, that, like, as in growing food together. If you think about Wikipedia, that's the community coming together and saying we're going to actually create a knowledge platform. We're going to share our knowledge. There's this thing called Wikispeed, where communities around the world have, been able to share design, and that actually helps the design of cars more locally. So it's communities actually using their resources to come together and actually create things, and they can be tangible and intangible things. So I guess it's making that more visible. But also the other thing there's another movement that we're involved in, and that's the community wealth building movement. So the Commons is more about communities' passion coming together and stewarding resources, whether or not that involves money. But community wealth building is, we need to actually keep more wealth local, because if we're going to have billionaires increasing their wealth in COVID, then it says it's time for communities to take more charge. We still do need the other sectors, and currently City of Sydney has actually, Deputy Mayor Jess Scully has actually put a motion to the to the council to actually develop a policy on community wealth building. And so they're looking at that very closely, and that involves procurement strategies where the city purchases from local businesses, local communities. So we're actually looking at how we do that.
It's important for those sorts of things to follow through, I think, and finding ways that allow communities and leaders alike to say, this is our next best step. And I guess this is something from Marie that was coming through in the conversation that you sort of started off earlier. And is it the same in large organizations? But so sort of things we're sort of hearing from Tarania and from Martin around identifying visions, but also movement that comes from the grassroots up, but also from top down. Is that the same in corporate, or is there a different sort of way of working when it comes to change in corporations?
Certainly a very interesting question, and hearing just the similarities as everyone else was speaking. So certainly that leadership, I think that's common across, it doesn't matter which industry you're in. But I think one of the main differences in corporate is often the metrics and measurement. An example that I can use there, we have wonderful analytical tools like Power Business Intelligence, whereby executives can look at performance across the entire business and drill down into, why is our inventory so high in Russia? And why is it taking so long to produce this pump in India? And why are we doing so well in producing the same pump in Latin America? So now we can actually learn from each other. And I think that's really exciting to see. It also creates an opportunity to really develop that global standardization. And I'm seeing more and more of that. And that's a very big ask. We live in such a global world, and we need to be able not only to work together globally, but also standardize the way we work, standardize the way we capture information, so that we can have these accurate reports at the very top level. And I think without that standardization of process and how information is captured in corporate, it's pretty much a guessing game and murky waters. So achieving that standardization of process is really not a small ask. And you can really work backwards from there, is to say, well, firstly, do we have process? Is it articulated clearly? Do our people know how to follow these processes? If I did a walk around tomorrow and ask anyone on the floor, where's the standard process? Do I just see puzzled looks around me? And then secondly to that is, do people realize that all of this information flows upwards? And how can we move the dial on those metrics that get reported at the highest level in the organization? And I think the other thing that we have in corporate is what we like to call performance management and measurement. And organizations vary in terms of their maturity and how they can use these tools. And by that I mean, you have your strategic objectives, and that then cascades all the way down to business unit and then to team. And every leader essentially would have skin in the game to say, well, you get measured and you have to report on how you are driving and leading the changes that really matter to the business.
That's fascinating. I really like the way that you're sort of connecting the idea of insights and data up to outcomes, and also using that to both demonstrate downwards to people who are experiencing the change, and also the leadership that need to understand what's taking place as well. Martin, in your work, you do a lot of research and investigation, and also forward thinking, as a futurist of change management in some ways. Are you seeing some of this kind of data-driven insight in your work, and what else? What else are you seeing that's arising out of change management in?
Yeah, it is an interesting observation. The kind of cute line that's playing in my mind as we talk is that sometimes governments create change, and sometimes change creates governments. It's slightly cute, so let me see if I can try and briefly explain it, and also explain what I think has been happening, particularly in the last 12 months, as I've been engaging with governments and working with them and clients, as well as just thinking about it and reading and so on. You think of something like the NDIS. The NDIS was essentially a very painstaking process of community movement, lots of advocacy, and at the end of the day, a government decision was taken to bring the NDIS into being. Okay, in that sense, we were ready for that change. A lot of work had been done. The Productivity Commission did its thing. Heaps and heaps of people in the disability sector and elsewhere over many years, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me, yes, there are times when governments can quite literally get up in the morning and with a sort of stroke of a pen and some decisions and a bit of spending and some money can really make big change happen quite dramatically. What I think we've discovered, particularly in the digital realm, interestingly, in the last 8 months, is that sometimes the changes that are going on outside create government action and response. I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had with government agencies and actually universities and a few other interesting institutions recently that have told me they've done more to change and reform and innovate and transform and all those lovely words, their organisation and their way of working and their entire culture, they'll tell me, in the last 8 months than they have in the last 8 years or even longer. So to some extent, COVID, I think, and the situation that we've been facing, the astonishing situation that we've had to face, has essentially said to governments, it doesn't matter whether you're change ready, change is ready for you, so get on with it. And remarkably, it strikes me, we have got on with it. You just think about a couple of quick examples. The Victorian state public sector was completely re-engineered during and through COVID to start building a structure that was focused on 8 big missions, essentially, that the public sector felt and the government felt needed to be put on the policy agenda as a way of building out post-COVID. They literally changed the structure of government, I wouldn't say exactly overnight, but kind of that fascinating example. See where it goes, see if it sticks. Will it roll back to its old habits later? It'd be an interesting question. You think about JobSeeker and JobKeeper and some of the regulatory reform that has been done in this country in the last 6 months, where, I've been reading and talking to senior public servants who tell me they've made regulatory changes in days and weeks that would normally take months and years. So there's no question that the balance of where change is driven, can governments do it for themselves, or do they sometimes have to follow the changes that are already happening, seems to me to be quite an interesting balance. What I am seeing, the final comment I'd make, is that I think there is a growing realization, and it does play back to both Tarania and Marie. I think there's a growing realization in government that the best way to navigate the imperative to do change, particularly when you have to work with speed and intensity, which is now the kind of hallmark of the world we're in, is you've got to, and this came out of some work I did with Charlie Leadbeater in the UK and others, so I'm picking up some other ideas here. You have to look up, you have to look down, and you have to look out, and you have to look sideways, by which I mean sitting in the middle of the change process, look up to see what's going on above you in terms of big, complex changes in the world around you, look sideways as to what other people are doing, learn rapidly, look down and through organisations down to the community and into the community to which you're also accountable. And definitely, I'm sensing very strongly in the last few months a growing desire, even in the midst of this kind of intense period, to look out and see who's doing what, who's doing the best, who's learning quickest, who's got the best idea we can copy, we can adapt, we can change. So I think that kind of balance, again, between are we ready for change or is change ready for us, is kind of what I've been seeing playing out in the last few months.
Brilliant. That's a really great observation. I really like that that up, down, sideways, and through.
Not entirely original, I've got to say. I grabbed onto that from some work I did, but I think it's very powerful. And I'm seeing more of it happening, including in the corporate world, to the extent I've been in that sector as well. So I think it is.
And Tarania, same. I guess that's. I guess the what Martin was saying there is there are multiple dimensions all taking place at the same time. I think you mentioned this earlier. The idea that we're having to chew gum and walk at the same time. We're having to deal with climate change. We're having to deal with a hospital system. We're having to deal with a pandemic and the economic impact of the lockdown and all those sorts of things all at the same time. And we're seeing some results that are starting to come through. They're saying things like that small businesses, we know that they consistently struggle in a good year with 9 or so percent failing in any one year, but the OECD is predicting or sort of indicating that we're seeing greater failure. That's going to put challenges into communities, right? We're going to see organizations struggle with resilience in terms of what do they do, how do they respond to all these changes. What can we do around that? What do we do from a community perspective to bring some of this kind of thinking, this complex thinking, into people's lives in a meaningful way?
Well, yeah, I mean, we connect. I think we connect. Well, I mean, sort of following on though, first of all, from what I was talking about, I think we look at these kind of models like community wealth building, as in how do we keep the wealth local? So that is where I talked about City of Sydney sort of seeing itself as an anchor institution in this model of community wealth building. You have anchor institutions, which is the large organisations like the councils, like the hospitals, like the universities, who look at how they can purchase locally to sustain the local businesses. the model also very much says that we need more cooperatives, so there is more community ownership. In Preston in the UK, so I'm just trying to find my notes. In Preston in the UK, they sort of markedly increased spending in the local area. It was kind of went something from I can't remember 4 million to I don't know, was it 13 million in a short space of time. So we kind of look at where the spending's going, but we also it's also like moving. We actually somehow have to move away from the philosophy that has been dominating our societies and our ways of operating, which is kind of winner takes all. So we have to go, how do we care about each other? So your local business matters to me, as so does as much as my local business. And let's just think, what do we actually all need? We need to actually we sort of all need to think we have a right to food, water, shelter. Let's kind of get back to why are we doing this? Why do we have our businesses? We have our businesses. Why was the economic set up? It was set up as a system to serve society. So let's put society first and then look at where does business sit with that. We actually have to invest time in building relationships, as in having long conversations with each other to understand what we're really grappling with. And look at how we can support each other and how we can co-create, and how our meaning and our purpose comes back to us because we're actually trying to create our communities and our world in a better way. I mean, some people are saying it's actually too late. We're talking about species extinction is there, but this is what we need to do.
Brilliant. Very, and that, I guess that was what I was hoping you were going to say, because that was a very passionate and very clear way of understanding how this could actually work and what we can actually do at those.
It can work.
Levels.
I mean, it can work. If I don't know if we're too late from the environment perspective, but in terms of humans, it can work.
So in a few minutes, we're going to be opening up the floor to questions. And if you are watching online, if you want to drop a question into YouTube, into the comment section there, that'll come through to us and we'll put it to the panel. In the meantime, Martin, in your book, you talk about the future of digital transformation, and Maria's been touching on some service transformation work that she's been doing, and you're saying that one of the big implications of that change is the very nature of the nature of public power and authority. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how we make decisions and the way that we set visions and make them come to life?
Yeah. So it's kind of a big topic, obviously, but one that needs to be landed, because I think somewhere close to the heart of the digital project, if you like, what we've been experiencing in many respects in our lives is in fact a very substantial disruption of where power lies, how power and authority, if you like, is gained and given. And it strikes me that in the public space, part of the challenge for politicians and public sector senior leaders and people who work in government is that the shifting nature of where that power lies is actually quite unsettling. Because certainly when I started working in the public service, which I had cause to remember the other day, was 1978, for heaven's sake, there were pretty clear views about who had power and who didn't have power, and it was a relatively straightforward game. Relatively straightforward. It wasn't entirely straightforward. It wasn't simply that governments could decree and off we went, but by and large, it was a relatively straightforward and fairly predictable game. 40 years later, that is not true. Mind you, there are new accumulations of power, as many people on this call again will know, particularly, in fact, emanating out of this digital world, where, in fact, for some of the larger players in that digital world, they've decided to accrue all sorts of power in ways that perhaps aren't all that helpful for the public cause. But my point is that I think you're right. I think the way we take big decisions about what we want as a society and where we need to go is definitely beginning to shift. And we are beginning to see people questioning quite deeply how you begin to move big systems and how you begin to reset some of those systems, whether they're systems of governance in the broader sense or in particular areas like education and learning or health or whatever. I will just reference here the work, and I'll get the reference put up so people can chase it down. The work, very recent work this year, in fact, a couple of months ago, by Charlie Leadbeater and a few folks out of Denmark from the Rockwell Foundation in Denmark, looking at the whole issue of system change and system transformation. And they basically, that's the link there. Do go and have a look at both the green paper, and in fact, there are some sessions going on this week if you want to tune in and listen. They basically talk about 4 elements that are beginning to be quite evidently substantial markers of the way we go about navigating this new world: relationships, resources, power, and then perhaps in a sense the most important word, which is purpose. This sense of clarity about what it is we're trying to do. And I'll come to that towards the end of our conversation about why I think, in a sense, the role and purpose of government is being deeply questioned, partly by the digital transformation that it wants to also harness to help answer that question, if that makes sense. So the digital transformation phenomenon is part of the challenge. It's also part of the solution. But in their work, Charlie and his colleagues have talked very directly and very pragmatically about the way in which you kind of get these 4 elements to work together: power, purpose, resources, and relationships. But in the end, his observation is that what shifts systems and begins to energize new sources and exercises of power is new types of relationship, both across and horizontally between ourselves as citizens. And I heard the other day from somebody I was talking to, a very senior former public servant, who said that the whole citizenship debate is right back on the agenda, partly because of COVID. And we can talk about that perhaps a bit later. But also this relationship between the governed, and the governors, the government. So the relationship issue they talk about is a lot. Anyway, I won't have time to unpack that in great detail. But I think the calibration about where we find, use, and apply power for public outcomes is definitely on the move, and I think that's both quite exciting but also a little unsettling.
I like the unsettling part. What is really interesting about that is that those 4, the power, purpose, resources, and relationships, was a little bit surprising to me. And maybe, Marie, if we just turn our attention to you for a moment, if we think about change strategy and sort of what you see, what are the things that surprise you? What are the things that are surprisingly effective, shall we say?
I get surprised every day. JJ, can I have that image, please? So this is a little bit like kindergarten. So some of you might recall, I don't know if it's the same in Australia as it is in South Africa, but sometimes you get given a little picture and you have to tell the story. It might be a picture of a kitten or something. So I'd love to tell you the story of this picture. This was very surprising to me. I was at a very low point on an assignment, and as you often think about the great creators of old, during a time of pain, you often come up with your most creative work. And this is pretty much what I decided when faced with this challenge is, well, here's your opportunity to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do something a little bit creative. So the challenge was that we were trying to influence and implement global processes for research scientists to follow. And the training event had been set up. The team had been working on these processes for a year, and the processes were signed off and approved by all of the a core group of subject matter experts all around the globe. So all we needed to do was stand up and tell them what to do. Now, some of you that deal with people might already start thinking, well, that could go wrong, right? We're dealing with very intelligent research scientists, 60 of them flying in from all around the globe, and we're just going to tell them what to do. So after a bit more of an investigation, we realized we really need to flip this event on its head, and we need to flesh and thread change management through everything that we're doing. It's less about telling them what to do. It's more about selling it and getting that buy-in and adoption before we can even start talking about following a process. And with scientists, I mean, give them the process and they'll follow it. That's not the issue. It's more about accepting a global standard and process. So what you see in front of you now is the change cycle, and it's one of my favorite tools to use to manage change. And you might have come across similar models in your life. There's the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Valley of Death and Despair, which was developed in 1969. Personally like this cycle because it shows change as a continuum. And I think we all cycle through this maybe multiple times a day or in a week. And it started by me just really teaching everyone about this cycle and helping people recognize where they are within this change cycle. So on day one, taught everyone to understand, you might be feeling fearful or cautious about this change. You might be feeling doubtful. And we asked everyone to plot themselves on the change cycle. So this is a sample of a visual that was on a table, and we had posters like this on every single table. And what you see here is a show of where we were at on day 4 of a 5-day program. On day 1, most of those post-its were on the red and the yellow zone. And they could see change working in front of their own eyes. So every day, at the start of day, I would say, well, yesterday we were all here. Today we seem to have shifted a little bit and we're now yellow. So really appeal to their analytical minds. And sometimes I think change management can be a little bit fluffy. So being analytical about change really helped drive that understanding of how important this process is. And the Chief Medical Officer was in the audience. And he completely bought into this process and then started adopting this across the board for all changes that they were trying to implement. So what you see there, the little tick marks, is really me doing an Excel spreadsheet every night to go back and plot it so that I can present a graph the next day to show how we had moved. And what you see, those post-it notes, they all represent process area. So a little yellow cloud would represent a process area. So it would be red on one and green on another. And you can also see the region. So we had CLTD, which was our global head office. We had CLASA, which was our Latin Americans. We had EMEA, which was Europe. So you could pretty much see, where every region was at and which process areas they felt comfortable with and not so comfortable with. And it was a funny thing. I had a wonderful audiologist to help me organize the event. And I said, you have to find at least 16 different kinds of post-it notes for this activity. And she went to Officeworks. She was running around to get ready for the event. And she asked me, so where do you normally find them? And I just said, well, there is no normal. We've never done this before. But it worked really well. And it was a good adoption for the change cycle.
So I love the idea of being able to map and show or even prove out the way that you can shift and change very quickly, because often what people don't realize is that they are shifting quite significantly in their mindset, but also not sort of recognizing that is taking place. So it makes it much more difficult as a change manager to be able to say, look where we're going. So by being able to use that data and that insight and to visualize it in such a compelling way is a great way of saying, look what we've achieved so far. We haven't even started yet.
Definitely sets you up for future change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a question from Craig out in the virtual online ether about how much does the panel believe Australian businesses, government and society will spring back to pre-COVID as usual after we recover? Or are we going to preserve these new practices? Are we going to keep what we're doing? What do you think? Let's start with you, Tarania.
Oh, okay. How much will we spring back? Look, I mean, some people are certainly talking about springing back, but I personally don't think we can just spring back, because I think COVID in some ways has been a gift to us, because we have got so many, once we get through COVID, people are saying there's going to be other pandemics ahead of us because of the way we are treating the earth. We are dealing with, climate change is getting worse, biodiversity is getting worse. So even if, some parts of society do actually sort of go back to business as usual, I don't think business as usual is sustainable. So I think, and so some of the new practices, I'm not sure which, there are different practices if we're talking about working from home, more Zooming. So there's some great things that have happened through COVID, as in so many of us have expanded our networks and expanded possibilities, because we are, engaging communities we never anticipated across the world because we've started using Zoom and connected. But at the same time, I'm also understanding that Zoom on itself, whilst people work from home, is actually just you don't get the collaboration that you need, that you actually get when you're face-to-face, those incidental conversations. And I did really love actually what Martin shared with us about relationships, resources, power and purpose. And relationships, I think, are critical for us to, I've said that so many times, but all of those are so critical for us to move forward. We really need to be really coming together and learning from each other and sharing both our ideas and our resources to actually be ready, or if ready is even the right word, as prepared as possible, as dynamic and adaptable as possible, to move into the greatest expression of ourselves, if that's even, if that's possible, for these phases that are coming before us.
Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm torn. I mean, I know Craig quite well, and I know where he's coming from, and I think there is a risk. There is a snapback risk. There's no question. I'm, I guess, sort of old enough and cranky enough to realise that sometimes, you put people under pressure, they start behaving in a certain way. You take the pressure away, they stop behaving that way. I get that, and I think that is a risk. But I'm going to take the positive view. People often ask me, are you a glass half full guy or a glass half empty guy? And I've now reached the stage in my life where I'm just happy there's a glass with some water in it. So let me be positive though, in all seriousness. The New South Wales government, I think through the Treasury, have just released a report about the economic benefits and implications of the home working and remote working experiment, amazing social experiment we've just been thrust into for the last 9 months. Very quickly, it turns out that on their best analysis, we're about 15 people are reporting, somewhere around about 15% more productive. We're gaining about an hour and a quarter a day, which we are investing in very intelligently from what I've read, partly into work. Yes, that's true. We've been working a little bit harder, but we've also invested it into a bit of us, a bit of time to go off and do that extra walk around the block or go swimming or whatever it might be, or do more regular exercise, and partly investing it back in the family. I cannot bring myself to think that we are going to chuck all that away when the so-called pressure, and it is pressure, it's been pretty terrible for some people, is going to go away. Now, it doesn't mean to say we're all going to Zoom for the rest of our lives and we'll never go and see each other. Of course that won't happen. But there will be a new settlement. There'll be a new balance, a new usual, which will not be the old usual. Largely because I think too many people have got a sense that there is a better way to conduct ourselves. That's just ways of working. Taran is exactly right. When you then talk about things like what we're doing to the way the climate debate has suddenly absolutely surged to the front of the room. And I think that's because we've suddenly got this deeper sense that there's a fragility and a vulnerability that has frankly affected every single person, not equally in my view. I don't quite buy the line that we're all in this exactly together, because we're not, but we're all in it, there's no question. And I think that has shifted people, and I cannot see that just snapping back to where we were in mid-2019. So I'm broadly an optimist and fairly energetic in where that might take us.
Marie, what do you think is going to snap back?
So that's very interesting. I'm with both Martin and Tarania on this one. Firstly, in terms of being really positive, what this meant for corporate. So very quickly, we all had to switch over and start using Teams, initially with pain and grumbling, but now it's become the norm. And what makes me really excited about that change is it opens up the door for more technology change. So what we're focusing on now as a business is to really harness technology to improve the way we mine. So be more sustainable, mine more safely. How can we make the Internet of Things work for us? How can we get people out of the pits by really harnessing technology? We've done it once. We've really embraced Teams, and we're operating, we're functioning, we're implementing things, and we're driving change. So that's really exciting. On the flip side, yes, there is engagement, and there is people to people speaking, understanding, knowing what people need to do in order to connect globally. And I don't think we can do that via a platform such as Teams. Working with people in India and in the US, there are just so many barriers, and if we don't face people face to face in a meeting room and get to understand and pick up on those expressions, I think it will continue to be a challenge, and we won't be able to spring back as quickly as we would like.
Interesting. One of the things that I'm observing, I think, over the last little while is not just the challenge of change, which we are obviously all thrust into, and also we used to have a sense of luxury, I think, around the concept of change fatigue. We used to say, "Oh, it's more change." Oh, and we were tired of that change. But I feel like we've kind of reached a new level because change has been thrust upon us, and it's unrelenting. What do you what's your concept around change fatigue? Are we better at change now because we're having to deal with it, or are we more tired, or are we just prioritizing things in a different way, do you think? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I'll just quickly jump in with I hope it's not a trite kind of observation, but it might at least. I think in the first phase, the first flush of this astonishing, intense emergency we've been in, and so many people will, I think, resonate with this because it's kind of the world we've been in. This notion that our work lives became relentless, almost unbearably unrelenting in terms of back-to-back team meetings, Zoom meetings, whatever platform you happen to be, even possibly StreamYard. And people were getting to the end of every day kind of wrung out. And what I have sensed more recently is a little bit of a kind of recalibration by people actually often giving advice and thoughts and tips and ideas to other people. Here's what I found to be useful. And by the way, when you schedule your day, don't forget that in the old days, there was a short gap between meetings because you had to walk to another room or indeed leave the building yet. So build a bit of gap in, We sort of started to get hold of this change relentlessness and start to moderate it slightly. In other words, I don't think we've just been sitting there as I think we did in the beginning of this pandemic, almost sort of helpless and just saying, oh my God, I've got 15 Zoom calls from 8 in the morning till 7 at night. And I haven't had a chance to go to the toilet, I don't think people are quite putting up with that anymore. So it's almost like we're saying, okay, the change pace has absolutely gone through the roof. But actually, we've also learned we're in a position where we can just take a little bit of that agency. I think we talked about that word earlier, a little bit of control back and say, hang on a minute, we've got to just get this a little bit more human, if you like. And then we can perhaps manage a bit better. So I'm inclined to think we're getting perhaps a bit better at it. But absolutely fatigue, I don't think there's any question right now, the middle of November. I think a lot of people are waiting for the middle of December. There's no doubt about that. And struggling a little bit to get through these last few weeks of what's been a pretty amazing year.
Tarania, what do you think?
I'm sort of picking up on Martin's point earlier when he said, we're not really all in this together. I mean, we are, when big issues come and we're all facing them, but, different people are facing different levels of precarity. So the networks, the groups, organisations that I'm sort of most closely working with, associated with, part of, are actually feeling the precarity. They're the smaller local organisations, be they social enterprise, be they citizens who are, looking at how to lead change, but they're grappling with their own day-to-day issues as well, or co-ops or whatever. And so for these groups, I don't know if I'd call change, maybe they say change fatigue, but it's kind of like, well, let's just say these are groups that also feel they're part of movements. And the movements have certainly grown in this period of COVID. So people are kind of, some of the groups are as more purposeful than ever. But then other of the groups are really in touch with those who are really uncertain once job seeker finishes, once JobKeeper finishes, whether they're going to be okay. There are many who are social entrepreneurs who get contracts, but they're just not certain whether they're going to get contracts, how long these contracts will last for or whatever. And but they really want to do this purpose work. So so that's kind of, so it's difficult. There you go.
Gary, you're on
mute. You're on mute, Kevin.
Murray, what do you think?
I've seen a huge change in terms of people's adaptability, and I have a favourite quote that I always like to use, and it's by Charles Darwin. It speaks about it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. And the changes that we are bringing to business, and my change realm, is really information systems. So these are the types of changes that will make business more efficient. We're working in a retracting business, so reduced headcounts, reduced hours, So all of the IT tools and information systems tools that we bring to the business is almost a blessing. So there is a lot more, bring it on quickly, let's get on with business, let's try and get across this new technology so that we can be more efficient and do more with less people. And that's the reality of the business world that we're living in at the moment. You're on mute, Gavin. Gavin,
you'll get the hang of this eventually. Don't worry.
I'll figure this out eventually. Yeah.
I think that's
we're getting close to the end of our hour together, so thank you for your time. But before we start to wrap up, can I get you each to think about a 30-second grab of what are we looking forward to? What is creating change like in this new way of living and working? Let's start with Martin.
Okay, I gave this a bit of thought. I'm going to go big, if that's okay. I think we're in the process of collecting or connecting the change process to some very, very big ideas about control, about power, and about authority. There's no question about that in my mind. And I think in the government and public sector space, we're beginning to see the emergence of a process of developing and designing what I would call the new public work, which I think is going to recalibrate the relationship between big issues around individual freedom and individual agency and the strength and resilience and health of the collective fabric, if you like, from which we derive ultimately our sense of resilience and security. And I think that's absolutely on the table right now.
Brilliant. Tarania.
Well, you know how I said that the movements have certainly grown, and I'm very much in touch with that sense that there is like that mycelium, lots happening underneath that lots of people can't actually see. And ecosystems that I'm connected into are just growing in the years that I've gotten to know the last few years. So I think these are going to emerge up. I mean, there's lots of other issues linking in with Martin's, but I just want to bring forward, there's lots happening there.
Great. Marie.
Yes, so my work is all about developing change management capability in corporate, and that's what I'm really excited about. I'd love to see change as just a way, that it's just the way we roll. It's not something special or new, and we have that capability and skill within us. I think every human is designed to deal and manage change, and it's just about designing a process and a mechanism for people to become more effective and efficient in managing change.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time this evening, and for everyone who's been watching, thank you for your time as well and for your attention. We've been recording this session as we do each time, and we'll be sharing it tomorrow. You can also catch any of our previous sessions at the New Ways website at the air.works/newways. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and let us know if we can help your audiences convene, create, and collaborate on our platform, the air.works. Thanks and good night. We'll close off this stream now. I hope you've had a good viewing experience. And if you have other questions that pop up, be sure to send them through via email. See you next time.
Thank you.